Hello and welcome to Being Prodigy. Now put on your headphones and start learning. To get special study material, just contact us through the link in the description.
In this chapter, we will study the behavior of an individual consumer in a market for final goods. 1. The consumer has to decide on how much of each of the different goods she would like to consume. Our objective here is to study this choice problem in some detail. As we see, the choice of the consumer depends on the alternatives that are available to her and on her tastes and preferences regarding those alternatives. To begin with, we will try to figure out a precise and convenient way of describing the available alternatives and also the tastes and preferences of the consumer. We will then use these descriptions to find out the consumer's choice in the market. The consumer's budget. Let us consider a consumer who has only a fixed amount of money, income, to spend on two goods the prices of which are given in the market. The consumer cannot buy any and every combination of the two goods that she may want to consume. The consumption bundles that are available to the consumer depend on the prices of the two goods and the income of the consumer. Given her fixed income and the prices of the two goods, the consumer can afford to buy only those bundles which cost her less than or equal to her income. Preferences of the consumer. The budget set consists of all bundles that are available to the consumer. The consumer can choose her consumption bundle from the budget set, but on what basis does she choose her consumption bundle from the ones that are available to her? In economics, it is assumed that the consumer chooses her consumption bundle on the basis of her tastes and preferences over the bundles in the budget set. It is generally assumed that the consumer has well-defined preferences over the set of all possible bundles. She can compare any two bundles. In other words, between any two bundles, she either prefers one to the other or she is indifferent between the two. Furthermore, it is assumed that the consumer can rank 7 the bundles in order of her preferences over them. Diminishing rate of substitution. The consumer's preferences are assumed to be such that she has more of good 1 and less of good 2. The amount of good 2 that she would be willing to give up for an additional unit of good 1 would go down. The consumer's willingness to pay for good 1 in terms of good 2 would go on declining as she has more and more of good 1. In other words, as the amount of good 1 increases, the rate of substitution between good 2 and good 1 diminishes. Preferences of this kind are called convex preferences. In difference curve, a consumer's preferences over the set of available bundles can often be represented diagrammatically. We have already seen that the bundles available to the consumer can be plotted as points in a two-dimensional diagram. The consumer's preferences over all the bundles can be represented by a family of indifference curves. This is called an indifference map of the consumer. All points on an indifference curve represent bundles which are considered indifferent by the consumer. Monotonicity of preferences imply that between any two indifference curves, the bundles on the one which lies above are preferred to the bundles on the one which lies below. Utility. Often it is possible to represent preferences by assigning numbers to bundles in a way such that the ranking of bundles is preserved. Preserving the ranking would require assigning the same number to indifferent bundles and higher numbers to preferred bundles. The numbers thus assigned to the bundles are called the utilities of the bundles, and the representation of preferences in terms of the utility numbers is called a utility function or a utility representation. Thus, a utility function assigns a number to each and every available bundle in a way such that between any two bundles, if one is preferred to the other, the preferred bundle gets assigned a higher utility number, and if the two bundles are indifferent, they are assigned the same utility number. It is important to note that the preferences are basic and utility numbers merely represent the preferences. The same preferences can have many different utility representations. Optimal choice of the consumer. In the last two sections, we discussed the set of bundles available to the consumer and also about her preferences over those bundles. Which bundle does she choose? In economics, it is generally assumed that the consumer is a rational individual. A rational individual clearly knows what is good or what is bad for her, and in any given situation, she always tries to achieve the best for herself. Thus, not only does a consumer have well-defined preferences over the set of available bundles.
This is Being Prodigy. To get special study material, just contact us through the link in the description, and please subscribe to show your support.
She also acts according to her preferences. From the bundles which are available to her, a rational consumer always chooses the one which she prefers the most. In the earlier sections, It was observed that the budget set describes the bundles that are available to the consumer, and her preferences over the available bundles can usually be represented by an indifference map. Therefore, the consumer's problem can also be stated as follows. The rational consumer's problem is to move to a point on the highest possible indifference curve given her budget set. If such a point exists, where would it be located? The optimum point would be located on the budget line. A point below the budget line cannot be the optimum. Compared to a point below the budget line, there is always some point on the budget line which contains more of at least one of the goods and no less of the other, and is, therefore, preferred by a consumer whose preferences are monotonic. Therefore, if the consumer's preferences are monotonic, for any point below the budget line, there is some point on the budget line which is preferred by the consumer. Points above the budget line are not available to the consumer. Therefore, the optimum, most preferred, bundle of the consumer would be on the budget line. Where on the budget line will the optimum bundle be located? The point at which the budget line just touches is tangent to one of the indifference curves would be the optimum. 8. To see why this is so, note that any point on the budget line other than the point at which it touches the indifference curve lies on a lower indifference curve and hence is inferior. Therefore, such a point cannot be the consumer's optimum. The optimum bundle is located on the budget line at the point where the budget line is tangent to an indifference curve. Demand. In the previous section, we studied the choice problem of the consumer and derived the consumer's optimum bundle given the prices of the goods, the consumer's income and her preferences. It was observed that the amount of a good that the consumer chooses optimally depends on the price of the good itself, the prices of other goods, the consumer's income and her tastes and preferences. Whenever one or more of these variables change, the quantity of the good chosen by the consumer is likely to change as well. Here we shall change one of these variables at a time and study how the amount of the good chosen by the consumer is related to that variable. Demand curve and the law of demand. If the prices of other goods, the consumer's income and her tastes and preferences remain unchanged, the amount of a good that the consumer optimally chooses becomes entirely dependent on its price. The relation between the consumer's optimal choice of the quantity of a good and its price is very important, and this relation is called the demand function. Thus, the consumer's demand function for a good gives the amount of the good that the consumer chooses at different levels of its price when the other things remain unchanged. The demand function is a relation between the consumer's demand for a good and its price when other things are given. Instead of studying the relation between the demand for a good and its price, we can also study the relation between the consumer's demand for the good and the income of the consumer. The quantity of a good that the consumer demands can increase or decrease with the rise in income depending on the nature of the good. For most goods, the quantity that a consumer chooses increases as the consumer's income increases and decreases as the consumer's income decreases. Such goods are called normal goods. Thus, a consumer's demand for a normal good moves in the same direction as the income of the consumer.
This is Being Prodigy. To get special study material, just contact us through the link in the description. And please subscribe to show your support.
However, there are some goods the demands for which move in the opposite direction of the income of the consumer. Such goods are called inferior goods. As the income of the consumer increases, the demand for an inferior good falls, and as the income decreases, the demand for an inferior good rises. Examples of inferior goods include low-quality food items like coarse cereals. A good can be a normal good for the consumer at some levels of income and an inferior good for her at other levels of income. At very low levels of income, a consumer's demand for low-quality cereals can increase with income. But, beyond a level, any increase in income of the consumer is likely to reduce her consumption of such food items. Substitutes and complements. We can also study the relation between the quantity of a good that a consumer chooses and the price of a related good. The quantity of a good that the consumer chooses can increase or decrease with the rise in the price of a related good depending on whether the two goods are substitutes or complementary to each other. Goods which are consumed together are called complementary goods. Examples of goods which are complement to each other include tea and sugar, shoes and socks, pen and ink, etc. Since tea and sugar are used together, an increase in the price of sugar is likely to decrease the demand for tea, and a decrease in the price of sugar is likely to increase the demand for tea. Similar is the case with other complements. In general, the demand for a good moves in the opposite direction of the price of its complementary goods. In contrast to complements, goods like tea and coffee are not consumed together. In fact, they are substitutes for each other. Since tea is a substitute for coffee, if the price of coffee increases, the consumers can shift to tea, and hence, the consumption of tea is likely to go up. On the other hand, if the price of coffee decreases, the consumption of tea is likely to go down. The demand for a good usually moves in the direction of the price of its substitutes. Shifts in the demand curve. The demand curve was drawn under the assumption that the consumer's income, the prices of other goods, and the preferences of the consumer are given. What happens to the demand curve when any of these things changes? Given the prices of other goods and the preferences of a consumer, if the income increases, the demand for the good at each price changes, and hence, there is a shift in the demand curve. For normal goods, the demand curve shifts rightward, and for inferior goods, the demand curve shifts leftward. Given the consumer's income and her preferences, if the price of a related good changes, the demand for a good at each level of its price changes, and hence, there is a shift in the demand curve. If there is an increase in the price of a substitute good, the demand curve shifts rightward. On the other hand, if there is an increase in the price of a complementary good, the demand curve shifts leftward. The demand curve can also shift due to a change in the tastes and preferences of the consumer. If the consumer's preferences change in favor of a good, the demand curve for such a good shifts rightward. On the other hand, the demand curve shifts leftward due to an unfavorable change in the preferences of the consumer. The demand curve for ice creams, for example, is likely to shift rightward in the summer because of preference for ice creams goes up in summer. Revelation of the fact that cold drinks might be injurious to health can lead to a change in preferences to cold drinks. This is likely to result in a leftward shift in the demand curve for cold drinks. Movements along the demand curve and shifts in the demand curve. As it has been noted earlier, the amount of a good that the consumer chooses depends on the price of the good, the prices of other goods, income of the consumer, and her tastes and preferences. The demand function is a relation between the amount of the good and its price when other things remain unchanged. The demand curve is a graphical representation of the demand function. At higher prices, the demand is less, and at lower prices, the demand is more. Thus, any change in the price leads to movements along the demand curve. Factors determining price elasticity of demand for a good. The price elasticity of demand for a good depends on the nature of the good and the availability of close substitutes of the good. Consider, for example, necessities like food. Such goods are essential for life, and the demands for such goods do not change much in response to changes in their prices. Demand for food does not change much even if food prices go up. On the other hand, demand for luxuries can be very responsive to price changes. In general, demand for a necessity is likely to be price inelastic, while demand for a luxury good is likely to be price elastic. Though demand for food is inelastic, the demands for specific food items are likely to be more elastic. For example, think of a particular variety of pulses. If the price of this variety of pulses goes up, people can shift to some other variety of pulses which is a close substitute. The demand for a good is likely to be elastic if close substitutes are easily available. On the other hand, if close substitutes are not available easily, the demand for a good is likely to be inelastic. Elasticity and expenditure. The expenditure on a good is equal to the demand for the good times its price. Often it is important to know how the expenditure on a good changes as a result of a price change. The price of a good and the demand for the good are inversely related to each other. Whether the expenditure on the good goes up or down as a result of an increase in its price depends on how responsive the demand for the good is to the price change. Consider an increase in the price of a good. If the percentage decline in quantity is greater than the percentage increase in the price, the expenditure on the good will go down. On the other hand, if the percentage decline in quantity is less than the percentage increase in the price, the expenditure on the good will go up. And if the percentage decline in quantity is equal to the percentage increase in the price, the expenditure on the good will remain unchanged. Now consider a decline in the price of the good. If the percentage increase in quantity is greater than the percentage decline in the price, the expenditure on the good will go up. On the other hand, if the percentage increase in quantity is less than the percentage decline in the price, the expenditure on the good will go down. And if the percentage increase in quantity is equal to the percentage decline in the price, the expenditure on the good will remain unchanged. the expenditure on the good would change in the opposite direction as the price change if and only if the percentage change in quantity is greater than the percentage change in price, i.e. if the good is price elastic. The expenditure on the good would change in the same direction as the price change if and only if the percentage change in quantity is less than the percentage change in price, that is, if the good is price inelastic. The expenditure on the good would remain unchanged if and only if the percentage change in quantity is equal to the percentage change in price, that is, if the good is unit elastic.
This is Being Prodigy. To get special study material, just contact us through the link in the description. And please subscribe to show your support. Thank you and happy learning.